Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. One of the many things I love about recording this podcast every single day is exploring areas that you might not think of, and especially think of being transformed by technology, and also the human stories behind them. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That and my wife saying, Neil, it's time to walk the dog. But I recently discovered a company called Kpler that has disrupted intelligence in commodity markets. It has dramatically increased the level of transparency of these traditionally opaque markets to the benefit of thousands of professionals worldwide. And Kpler's data is considered as a reference right across the commodity industry, and it covers liquid commodities such as crude oil, refined products, as well as gas commodities such as liquefied natural gas, petroleum gas, and petrochemicals, etc. But underneath all that is an inspiring story. So I invited François, who is one of the founders on the podcast today, to talk about Kpler, his story, and also the benefits of bootstrapping and being a self-funded company, and how the instant success of Kpler meant that they never needed external funding, and he's rightly proud to be self-funded. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to London, where François, co-founder of Kpler, is waiting to speak with us right now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yes, thanks, Neil, for having me today. It's great to be with you. So my name is François Cazor. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of a company called Kpler. Essentially, Kpler is providing real-time transparency on the commodities markets. And a little bit more about me is I live in London with my wife and kids.
Fantastic. And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a little bit of research, and Kpler is often likened to flight radar, and the Kpler terminal will tell users exactly what's going on in the commodity markets, but in real time. So can you set the scene and tell me more about the kind of problems that you set out to solve with technology from the very beginning?
Yeah, it's a good question. So look, I'll say you have to look at the market we are operating in to answer this. So broadly speaking, we deal with commodities and shipping. And traditionally, these markets have been very, very opaque for decades. And when I mean opaque, I mean like literally nobody knows who's doing what. And there is a very large asymmetry of information between buyers and sellers. So what Kpler is doing is that we are organizing the information at a very granular level, but like granular, like molecules of the supply chain of these physical commodities. And so we are able to tell the story behind these molecules, these cargoes, essentially where it's produced, where it's loaded, discharged, who's involved, buying, selling, and then the classic question about the volume, the price, and the quality of the shipments.
And on this Daily Tech podcast, I'm always fascinated by the story behind companies and also the role of serendipity. And I would say that one of the most questions I get asked is, after 1,500 interviews, what is the one thing that everyone has in common of these tech startup leaders and founders, etc.? And I would say serendipity for the large part, but those happy accidents that happen in life. It's almost like the universe gives us a little nudge in the right direction when we need it most. So can you tell me the story behind Kpler, which I believe began after a chance meeting in New York way back in 2009? Is that right?
Yeah, it's right. Look, for us, it's like I share with my co-founder Jean a background in financial markets. So we were friends for engineering school, and look, we've had careers, both of us, in the banking side, so on the bonds and equities. We've done this for 7 years, and actually we were a bit tired with a big corporate job. So we were just happening to be, because I was living in Europe and he was living in the US, and we were happening to be together in New York. So that was 11 years ago, just having a drink between friends. And we realized that we were both in the same setup, which is extremely bored let's say, the very corporate life we had. And I think we both of us wanted to get back to the roots of engineering, which is essentially building things. And so that's where it started, which is, it's not too much an idea. It's more about a fundamental will to do something and build something, and just and I would say be your own boss. But it's not too much about authority. It's much more about freedom, and deciding where you want to go. So that's what we decided in New York, and then it took us, let's say, in a bit more complicated journey than what we initially thought. It took us 11 years to really make it. But it's a long story. Yeah.
Love that. And from the moment there was two guys being bored with their banking jobs. How did that lead to you making the leap with Kpler? And I've also got to ask, where did the name Kpler come from?
So actually, initially, the company was not called Kpler. It was called Kyoto Market. Initially, when we created the company, it was supposed to be geared toward the carbon market. That was quite a hot topic when we let's say, left our corporate job. And so we had to pivot because the initial company wasn't really successful, let's say. And along this pivot, we had to change the name. So back then, we were still at a phase where we're not sure what we would do. And so Kpler is directly coming from Johannes Kepler, who is one of the father of the law of attraction. And look, with removing one E, we could get a 5-letter domain name that was free. And the name was generic enough to be able to, let's say, plug anything, let's say, quantitative. And we knew that whatever we built, it would be quantitative. So that's how it started.
And what was it that made you pivot to commodities then? Is there a story there too?
Yes, we just, so when we decided to just leave our job and build something, carbon market was a very hot topic, growing everywhere. And a lot of people were describing it as the next big thing. So we started on this. And after a few years, we realized that we made a lot of mistakes, which is, I think, quite common when you create a company for the first time. Essentially, we didn't research enough on the market, on the need, and the capacity to pay, etc., etc. And so while we were able to pay the bills and survive, it was clearly not growing, and we need to change. So we've started, let's say, maybe a 12-month period where we've been meeting a lot of people in the industry and realized that next to us, we were seeing other needs. So actually, our early clients on the carbon markets were a bit struggling to grow themselves. I would say there's no surprise. If the market you are in and your clients are not, let's say, being super successful, well, it's going to be difficult for you to be successful. That's what was happening to us. And by talking to the industry, we realized that a good amount of these people that were doing carbon were about to be changing to a new market that was natural gas that was growing very quickly everywhere. And pretty simply, we went on a journey to get to meet them, talk to them, and we realized that there was a strong need in terms of purely transparency, which is essentially one of these early clients told us, look, my day-to-day job is to trade cargoes, natural gas cargoes. And yet I keep receiving calls about people trying to sell me solutions to track the vessels to the ships. But the ship itself, I don't care too much. It's much more about what's inside. And we realized that there was, let's say, wealth of information scattered everywhere. That was, let's say, a bit unutilized. And so we built a tool to aggregate all of this information and display information on these cargoes.
And one of the things that really stood out for me when I was researching you guys is that you enjoyed pretty much instant success, and the company has never needed any external funding, which has got to be something that you're incredibly proud of. But what tips or advice would you offer to any startup founder that could be listening to this podcast today, anywhere in the world, and inspired by your story? Is there any advice that you would pass on to them?
Yeah, so I would say it starts, it's not a dogma, which is, we never said, okay, we don't want to raise anything that's against our belief. It's more that we couldn't. So during the first phase, when we were active on carbon markets, the growth was just not good enough. And so we're looking to raise just to, let's say, survive. and we couldn't. So we had to learn, let's say, the hard way, which is like properly bootstrapping and just moving money from your own bank account to pay the bills for the company. So that was, let's say, a difficult experience that kind of, I would say, taught us how to do it. And so when we pivoted to this initial natural gas market in 2013, actually, we know we were well trained in terms of surviving with little resources. And so within a few weeks, we were cash flow positive. I should say as well, Neil, that we were lucky enough to be in what I would call niche markets, but very rich niche markets. I think you have a number of startups that are trying to sell, let's say, a few hundreds of dollars a year to thousands or millions of people. We are doing the other way around, which is our market is few hundreds of accounts, but each account is quite sizable in terms of revenues you can make out of them. You can even get like, let's say, around 7 figures per account. So of course, that's not where you start. But I mean, with this kind of market, if you find traction quickly, well, we just never needed to raise. That's the key, which is the fact that we could sell. And let's face it, the beauty of the data model in B2B is like you pay upfront for your data. So that's like just free cash flow coming to your bank directly. Thanks to this, we could grow initially, and after a few months in business, we had a good cash balance, and we felt, okay, let's keep doing. And ever since we started, we had a very, very simple principle, which is saying, look, we know how much we spend per head, per employee, and so as soon as we onboard new revenues that is on par with our cost per head, then we're going to hire another guy. And we had this kind of very simple rule when we were 2 guys in my kitchen, and we still have this. And as of today, we are 130 people. So it started with this kind of very basic rule, and then we've been tempted, let's say, many times to raise. We've had several offers, and we just couldn't see real value out of it, which is the business was able to grow by itself. And as I said initially, I think both Jean and I were super happy to have a total freedom, which is being able to decide your roadmap and where you're going to place your priorities and just choose the people you're going to work with. All of this for us became something that is really, really important, really valuable, that has made our success. And so that's why I think we've stayed in this fully bootstrap mode. Look, in terms of advice, I'm not sure I'm at the stage where I can give advice to anybody, but it's more about that I think equity in the very first months of your company, it looks something that has no value. But later on, you'll realize that it's actually extremely valuable. Like it's the most precious thing you have. So diluting equity for, let's say, just compensating for short-term pain, well, I think it's a trade-off that should be really measured. And I think as well it has to do with, let's say nowadays, let's face it, a lot of people are placing a lot of attention on the money you raise and how much you raise. And it's a lot of time perceived as, like the end of the game, which is that's it. You raise your Series A, Series B, you're done. And actually, we always looked at it in a very different way, which is not being in a position where you don't need to raise is really the real win. And we believe the only metrics that should be, let's say, celebrated is just revenues. That simple, which is how much money are you able to build from your client, and that's quite rare. So yeah, I think it's quite rare to hear about bootstrap companies. Clearly, much rarer than the venture-backed companies. But I think as well, let's say with nowadays tech stack, well, literally you can build a business from your laptop just with a basic Wi-Fi. Everything is just much easier. When we started, there was no such thing as Amazon Web Service, for example. So just the very fact to have a web server running was not that easy. And so there were more costs. So I think if there is one time where you can bootstrap and build something from scratch, that's now, because tech is so cheap and so good, available everywhere.
And I think something else that we all do very often, especially in the media, is we celebrate the success of others, but not necessarily the journey that they've been on and the years and years of blood, sweat and tears. And I think it's worth highlighting here that your first startup ended in an instant and your second was an instant success. So I'm curious, what lessons did you learn from and take away from both of those experiences?
Yeah, so I think the first startup, so it let's say took us a while to realize it was not going anywhere, and I think that's precisely would be my first let's say lesson from it is like, don't fall in love with your idea, which is I don't think ideas are worth anything. And I remember like when we were creating the company early on, like 10 years ago, we were so persuaded to have like the genius idea that we wouldn't talk to anybody and we keep it super secret. And looking back at it now, it's so stupid. Like we waste a ton of time on this because it's so difficult to make your own idea a success. So imagine how more complicated it is to even like just take someone else's idea and just try to execute it. So I would say this, which is don't fall in love with your idea and assume that it will for sure not go as planned. That things will not happen as you forecasted it. It will be more difficult, and that is like for sure. I think the first thing, and then be flexible, which is that's why I think a lot of people place, especially early on, a lot of importance in the team, and I think that's what's super valuable. It's like just the combination of people that will work together and be able to adapt if something goes wrong, and inevitably it will go wrong. That I think is the real value. And then the idea on which you execute, well, it's very much secondary. You maybe you can choose, let's say, the domain. So for us, it was, let's say, commodities, shipping, globally speaking, and we changed from something to something else. So we could still, let's say, use a bit of our knowledge, but what we're doing now, the success we have has just literally nothing to do with what we started with. And even when we started, we didn't have any knowledge of what we do now. I didn't know anything about this. So yeah, I would say just stay flexible and for sure, don't fall in love with your idea, because just so many people are doing it, and I think it's just a waste of time.
Fantastic advice. And here in 2021, if we have any techies listening, could be located anywhere in the world and want to take a little look under the hood, can you tell me a little bit more about the advanced technology behind Kpler that has the ability, I believe, to crunch over 10 million data points from over 500 plus different sources every day to provide that real-time global intelligence that you offer? So can you tell me a little bit more about the tech behind all that?
Yes. So look, it's going to be the usual suspect. So let's say a combination of various data engineering technologies like machine learning and big data. But I think the most interesting part is telling you why we need this arsenal of technology. And so essentially Kpler is a real-time data refinery. So that's the best way to define it. So we source raw signals from a lot of different places. So it can be satellite imagery, optical and radar imagery, actually, drone imagery as well, web scraping, we do a lot. So it's all of these signals that we ingest in real time. And the real complicated part is that the huge majority of these data sources are totally unstructured and incomplete. So sometimes it's not even accurate, which is it can even be on purpose. So the value is in let's say cleaning all of this data and of course making it understandable for our business algos that will rank all different data sets together. And there is a time element as well, which is a good amount of the signal we gather are about the future. And sometimes just future will not happen as it was planned, or sometimes it was incorrectly reported, or sometimes it was, let's say, linked with an error on purpose. So the difficulties is about treating all of these signals together and building a framework that can ingest and crunch all of the signals. So we built a big model that essentially is, let's say, a digital twin of the reality of the logistics of the markets we track. And our algos are then feeding these models by cleaning the large pipelines of data I described. After that, we have an enriching layer where we built essentially an internal tech that our analysts and market experts can use to control the data quality. And at the very end of the pipeline, you have a visualization layer where you can access the data and build dashboards or plug to Excel, Tableau, and different type of SDK. So that would be let's say a description of our tech stack.
And what's next for Kpler? Where do you go from here? And are you just continuously requesting other features, or is there anything you can share about what's keeping you busy right now?
Yeah, so look, the clients just want more and more, which is there is no end to the race for a perfect data quality. So essentially being able to literally capture every single movement on Earth of a commodity and just be able to describe who's behind. So there is a big job on this. And then I would say it's turning, and we're getting back a bit to our roots. The vision we have is that while I was working on the banking side, my day-to-day was just literally living in Bloomberg terminal because everything was in it and you didn't need anything else. Well, we believe that the commodities and shipping markets need something like that. And so far, they are served by a variety of different providers that have to be, let's say, difficultly merged by the clients. Well, we want to build Kpler terminal into this terminal where you would have complete visibility on the logistics supply chain for the commodities.
And for anyone listening that would like to find out more information about anything that we've talked about today and just find out how Kpler could help them or contact your team, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, we're a bit old school, so it's going to be Kpler.com. That's simple. Now we have the LinkedIn, the Twitter, and all the social network handlers, but clearly Kpler.com is still the best way to reach us. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for spending a bit of time with me today and sharing your story. I'm sure it'll inspire a lot of people out there, especially startup founders. And also, it's incredibly cool what you're doing there with technology and commodity markets in real time and the value that you're offering traders, analysts, charters, etc. The list goes on. But more than anything, just thanks for sharing all that with me today.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much.
I think in 2020, Kpler went over $30 million in bookings. And like I said at the very beginning, like Flight Radar, the Kpler terminal tells you exactly what's going on in commodity markets in real time. And they're using advanced technology such as artificial learning, machine learning, satellite imagery interpretation, etc., to enable the platform to have the ability to crunch over 10 million data points from over 500 plus different sources every day. But strip all that back, and it all began after a chance meeting in New York back in 2009, where two friends had met in the early 2000s studying engineering in Paris, decided they were bored of their jobs and would try something different. And the rest, they say, is history. So a big thank you to François for sharing that very rich story with us all today. And I know we have people listening in, I think it's something like 179 countries right now. And you all have stories equally as valuable as that, and stories of serendipity, chance encounters, happy accidents, and I want to hear them too. So please share them by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can send me a DM on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes, or pop by my website, techblogwriter.co.uk. So let's keep those stories coming, keep sharing them, and maybe we can all learn a thing or two from each other. But I'm afraid we're out of time yet again. So I'll be waiting for you inside your podcast feed first thing tomorrow morning. A big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.